Hello, everyone, and welcome back. It's another Saturday recap, and let's go ahead and talk about some of the news. So, one of the big things going on is the anti-gun legislation or the gun control legislation that went through the House of Congress this week. If you've been watching the news, you'll know that Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the Democratic Socialist, the member of the DSA, is very upset that multiple Democrats crossed the aisle to vote to fix the background check systems. That's what this gun control bill really was, is it was an attempt to correct errors, flaws, and damage to the NICS system. Now, the one big objection that she and many other Democrats had to this bill was the addendum in it that stated that ICE was to be contacted if an illegal alien filled out a background check request form and attempted to submit it through a federal firearms license dealer. Now, considering illegal aliens are not allowed to own firearms in the United States, they are one of the restricted classes, just like felons and people who are underage. It makes no sense. What they are literally doing is advocating scofflawism. And anybody who's been watching me for a while, you'll know that I have a very, very potent argument about scofflawism. Primarily, it comes back to prohibition. That's right. The prohibition of alcohol in the United States literally turned the nation into a nation of scofflaws. Hundreds of thousands of people were prosecuted under the Prohibition of Alcohol Acts during Prohibition, and most of them were normal, everyday, common citizens who had had a drink. And they were charged with public intoxication, public indecency, violation of the Alcohol Prohibition Act, things of that nature. One of the things that the left continues to forget is that in order to be a nation of laws, you have to have effective laws and enforce them. If you do not enforce your laws, you don't have effective laws. And this is one of the problems with the argument that, that illegal aliens are just coming here for a better life, is that you have laws, and yet you want to not enforce them because you feel sorry for someone. Well, the truth is that while we can have mercy and we can have sympathy, if we don't have effective laws, then we don't have rule of law, and we don't have justice, and we don't have a concerted nation that has a definitive this is right, this is wrong capability to understand society and its framework through. This in turn promotes more lawless behavior. It's the reason the broken window theory of policing works, is because if you punish and adjudicate the small crimes, you reduce the massive crime, because the criminals who would commit larger crimes know that they're going to get caught and punished, because you even punish people who commit the small crimes. And it's part of the problem in this country that we've been facing for the past 30 years when it comes to law enforcement. We have neglected dealing with the small everyday crimes and keeping up on the control of the small everyday crimes. And we have effectively allowed large crime to flourish because of it. And part of this has to do with funding for organizations like ICE, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, local police departments. Part of it has to do with the demonization of police. And part of it has to do with this idea that the United States is corrupt and damaging and all laws need to be ignored. So anyhow, that's what Occasional Cortex is up to. Thank you, Andrew Klavan, for coining that concept of her. Also, Ilhan Omar has reset her anti-Semitism counter. It's been less than 2 weeks since her last anti-Semitic comment, and here she goes again. This week at a bookstore in New York, her and Rashida Tlaib made multiple discussion points about why they should be allowed to be anti-Semitic, including the argument that if it's okay to talk about the NRA and CPAC and big oil and big pharma and all these other lobbying groups, then they should be able to attack the Jews over AIPAC. Well, the truth is, AIPAC is, yes, a political action committee. If you want to say AIPAC, along with all other political action committees, should not be allowed in politics, that is a justifiable statement. Stating that it's all about the Benjamins in referring to support of Israel, that's the fallacy that Jews are buying people. It really is. And I'm not saying this in any way to support her statement. I'm saying it to bring light to this statement. I support Israel. I've never received any money from Israel or AIPAC or any organization to support Israel. I support Israel because they are a democracy. I can actually walk the streets of Israel openly pagan and not be put to death. Israel is part of the Middle East, part of the former Byzantine Empire, part of the Roman Empire, part of the Alexander the Great Greek Empire, and it has huge historical significance. And all people are welcome in Israel as it is currently set up. Muslims, Jews, pagans, Christians, atheists, anyone who wants to go into Israel can without feeling threatened and have the same rights. That is not true for most of the Middle East. Heck, in most of the Middle East, you cannot become a citizen unless you are part of a Muslim family born to that nation. Okay? Even if you immigrate there legally, you can't become a citizen. Your children can't become citizens. So, why wouldn't I support them as an ally, a friend, and a group in that region that respects my ideas of liberty, of freedom, of independent thought, self-rule? Why would I not support that? It's the same reason I support Britain. It's the same reason I support Australia. It's the same reason I support South Korea. As much as South Korea has a lot of problems, they are an ally of the United States. They try to self-govern. They try to leave people free to do what they want. That doesn't mean they're perfect at it, but they're at least trying. It's also the reason I reject totalitarian states. I'm not a fan of Saudi Arabia. I'm not a fan of Iran, of Qatar. I'm not a fan of Cuba or Venezuela. I'm not a fan of even how Colombia runs its government. I think that they could do a lot better. I'm also not a fan of the corruption in Mexico or the insane positions that Canada has been taking. And speaking of Canada, Canada now has a huge push to remove firearm rights from its citizenry. I want to thank Irving Twin, the drunken Canadian. He is one of the people I'm subscribed to. He and I follow each other on a lot of social media. We talk on occasion. We're fairly good friends. He brought this forward last weekend, and I wanted to talk about it right now. Canada has people pushing to disarm Canadian citizens after a mass shooting on Canada's streets. Now, the truth is many of those people who were killed would not be dead if Canada didn't have the strict gun laws it already has, because some of those people would have been carrying. I think that we as American citizens should support the Canadians who are pushing for a Canadian concealed handgun allowance and pushing to keep the handgun rights that they have. I think that this is an important thing for a self-armed citizenry to have awareness of what their government is doing and to be able to stand up against their government and to stand up against criminals. Because, once again, when you are in imminent danger, the police are minutes away. And so if you cannot defend yourself, you are effectively a victim, no matter what. Even if you don't get shot, you are a victim because you are standing there in the line of fire and you know that you have no control to take back from the person attacking you. And while Canada is going one way with its gun control laws, the state of Kentucky has implemented constitutional carry. as well as Oklahoma. This makes multiple states in the United States who now have constitutional carry, and it is a big movement moving in red states. I hope to see more of this. I would love to see a national Second Amendment carry revolution occur, but I don't think it will happen in places like California, New York, and even Massachusetts, where people believe that you don't have the right to individually own guns. So I will settle for mostly red states accepting and adopting this mentality, and I think it is a good thing for the nation. Now, many people are saying it's going to turn into the Wild West. We have not seen this. In fact, in many of these states with constitutional carry, many of the people carrying have gone and received even further training than many states require. And in most cases, there are actually fewer incidences of aggressive personal crime going on in many of these states. Even though many of these states were low personal crime to begin with, the numbers have dropped even further simply because you now can't tell anything about who's carrying or not if they're effectively concealed carrying. And the fact that anybody can, no matter their financial status or their capability to purchase training at many of these expensive academies, which actually prohibits poor people from concealed carrying, it has effectively started reducing personal crime in poorer neighborhoods. Because these people can carry now. They don't have to spend $200, $300, $400 to get a permit like they do in many other states. Now they're just purchasing their gun and carrying. And while this can create dangerous situations, I think morally and ethically the legal gun owners in the United States do a far better job of not being bullies and not brandishing and not being destructive than any of the criminals justify us taking guns away from people. Now, there was a lot of other news, including the fact that the Washington governor, Bill Inslee, is running for president now. He is running on a campaign of climate change. Now, this man has done nothing but raise taxes and create more regulation in the state of Washington. In fact, he has tried to push multiple cap-and-trade and carbon taxes. He has pushed expansions of business taxes. He has failed to stop soda taxes on a statewide level, and he has basically pushed the California socialist agenda in Washington, just like Governor Kate Brown has effectively pushed the California socialist agenda in Oregon. For all intents and purposes, they basically hold the same stances, and I will not support either one of them. Speaking of candidacies, it seems that the DNC has literally expanded their field to the point where nobody can gain a clear majority. Even the frontrunners like Joe Biden are under 30% or at 30% at best in most polls. Now, this shows that the Democrat Party is severely fractured. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't pull a rabbit out of their hat like the Republican Party did in 2016. In 2016, the pack was huge. There were a lot of candidates running, and realistically, the vote structure was severely fractured. Eventually, the party backed Trump, and we got President Trump. That's not a bad thing. It's not a good thing. He's done some bad stuff. He's done some good stuff, and we're going to talk about that just in a second. But this also means that the Democrat Party has got to really look at what its platform is, because right now they don't have one. There's discussion about climate change, AOC's Green New Deal, other different types of programs. Nobody has created an actual viable, unified program, not even Nancy Pelosi, who is running the House. Her agenda items that she put forward this week were basically general DNC talking points. No information on how they're going to accomplish them. No real details on whether or not they can actually get this stuff passed. And with the fact that you've got a Republican majority in the Senate plus a Republican president, the likelihood of most of this stuff passing the way they want it to is not very high. So now let's talk about the president. So the Cohen testimony came out this week, and if you've been looking at it, it was basically a nothing burger. The only real evidence Michael Cohen presented to Congress to prove anything was checks from Donald Trump reimbursing him for the payment to Stormy Daniels. Now, we know that President Trump has worked with the National Enquirer, as well as Michael Cohen and other people, to stop stories from leaking about him doing all sorts of sexual misconduct deeds. We knew this when he was elected, people. Heck, the National Enquirer and the Daily Star and all sorts of tabloids have run pieces on him for decades. Most of them unfounded, some of them real, some of them not. But the idea that this really moves the needle is rather foolish, because we already knew that he reimbursed Michael Cohen for paying Stormy Daniels. We already knew that President Trump was using go-betweens and third-party intermediaries to pay off women and to hush stories. This is not news. It really is not. All this did was give them another bit of evidence that this was already going on. And the idea that this is technically a campaign finance violation, because he paid him back, at best, you could rule, you might get a judge to rule, especially in southern New York City, that this was a failure to report. President Obama had multiple failures to report. He paid multiple fines for this. This is not something that presidents get impeached on. So the Democrat push to impeach is fairly ignorant. Now let's talk about the North Korea summit in Vietnam. This didn't go so well. I was really hoping that we would hear some good news about negotiations of this point. I don't think that this is going to go the way I was hoping. Once again, it was foolish, naive hope on my part that we might get anything done with North Korea. I mean, North Korea has basically been a slag heap since the end of the Korean War, which Korean War ceasefire occurred in the early 1960s, I believe. A serious armistice occurred. It didn't end the war, but it effectively created no man's land and the demarc where people can't cross, which, by the way, has more wildlife in it than you would know, because it's just full of wildlife because nobody lives there and nobody can do anything there. Now, this could still end up being a win for Trump. Him walking away, not being willing to lift the sanctions, does show that he is serious about getting denuclearization in North Korea. I think Chairman Kim is showing his disingenuity by wanting, the United States to pull out of Korea completely and remove all sanctions, and then he might decommission a few sites. That's, if you want the prize, you have to be willing to do the work. And this, in this case, means that you're going to have to completely destroy your nuclear weapons program and remove all your missile launch sites and decommission any of your refinement reactors that can handle spinning up past 3% fuel enrichment. It's that simple. If you want to create a unified Korea, and you want to get the grand prize of, the availability of trade with North Korea and all that stuff, that is what you're going to have to do, Chairman. And if you're not willing to do that, and you're not willing to look at the civil rights violations of your own regime and everything else, you're not going to be able to get what you want from Western society. You are going to have to meet us halfway. We're not saying you've got to be, removed from power, although likelihood, if you disarmed your nuclear requirements, many of your people might decide to eat you as, recompense for all the damages that you've done to them. But that's not what we can control. We can't control your people. All we can control is saying, this is what it requires to be part of a civilized society on Earth. And if you're not willing to accept those, then you're going to have to stay an uncivilized society. I'm sorry. That is part of the requirement of growing up. You have to learn to respect and play with others on an equal footing. And these equal footings are imbued by law, and we regulate the law by enforcement. And if you're not willing to follow these basic concepts, then realistically, we're not going to play. Because we don't have to. And that's about it for the recap this week. I hope you've all had a great week. I hope you're having a great Saturday. I look forward to seeing you sometime in the next few days. I'm going to try to get a video up for Monday and Tuesday this week, and maybe even a fourth extremist ANCAP review, because the extremist ANCAPs continue to try to blow up my comment blocks on different media sites, stating that I'm misrepresenting ANCAPism, even though, you know what? I think I've got a pretty good idea of it. Well, thank you all again for joining.